Thanks for meeting yesterday. I appreciate your acknowledgement then and again this morning that inflation is way too high. During our discussion, you said that if inflation persists, you'll do, and I quote, whatever it takes, end quote, to get inflation under control, even if it were to unfortunately trigger a recession, which I know no one wants, couldn't precisely predict, and I hope is quite unlikely. But just for the record this morning, is that a fair characterization of your view of fighting inflation?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, it is. I strongly believe that inflation is far too high today, and I'm committed to bringing it down to the Federal Reserve's target of 2%.
Great. Thank you. Now, there's folks who have openly argued that climate change poses such an existential threat to humanity that we simply have to dispense with democratic norms and use financial regulatory powers to accelerate the transition to a lower carbon economy. So, Professor Barr, my question for you is, does the Fed's mandate permit the Fed to use its power to accelerate the transition to a lower carbon economy?
Senator, thank you for that question. The Federal Reserve's authorities here are important but quite limited, quite narrow.
Right.
And those are to assess risks to the financial system from all sources, including
I understand,
climate.
Professor, I've got very limited time, and so I understand what the Fed's powers are. My question is, do you believe that the Fed's mandate allows it to use its power to decide to accelerate the transition to a low-carbon economy?
No, Senator. I think that the Federal Reserve is not able to allocate credit, should not be in the business of telling financial institutions to lend to a particular sector or not to lend to a particular sector.
And thank you for that. And so would you agree that that extends to the fact that the Fed does not have the authority to use climate-related stress tests for the purpose of penalizing banks for lending to energy companies, for instance?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. The only purpose of the Federal Reserve's scenario analysis or other measures should be to understand risks that climate might pose to the financial system and to work with financial institutions on measures to manage those risks.
Great. Thank you. There have been in some quarters a great deal of hostility to bank mergers, especially in recent months where there appeared to be a de facto moratorium on approving mergers that would result in a bank of more than $100 billion in assets. Now, it's clear to me that bank regulators have no statutory authorization to impose a universal moratorium on bank mergers. So do you agree that the Fed does not have the authority to impose a blanket moratorium on bank mergers?
Thank you, Senator. I'm not aware of any authority with respect to a blanket moratorium on bank mergers.
Yeah, I think if there were such an authority, I think you would be aware of it. I think that's because there is no such authority. But I do want to point out, I'm concerned acting comptroller of the currency, Michael Hsu, has proposed conditioning regional bank mergers on their commitment to meet what would otherwise be inapplicable regulatory standards and requirements. To me, this is an attempt to establish this requirement. This attempt exceeds the OCC's authority. And ironically, making it more difficult for regional banks to merge could actually decrease competition within the banking industry by preventing larger regional banks from being able to compete with very large banks. So let me ask you this. Do you agree that regional bank mergers can, in some circumstances, actually increase competition in the banking industry by better enabling them to compete with larger banks?
Thank you, Senator. I think that bank mergers can have positive effects or negative effects on both competition, convenience and needs, financial stability. I don't have an a priori view. I think the merger should be conducted based on the evidence.
Okay, thank you. I do want to talk a little bit about the SLR also. The Fed announced in March of last year, I think, that it would consider modifications to the SLR, and the idea was to ensure that it serves as a backstop, not the primary driver of capital requirements. As Vice Chair of Supervision, so that's over a year now, and we haven't seen the proposal, I think in part because the seat to which you've been nominated hadn't been filled. If you are confirmed, would you commit to expeditiously issuing a proposal to ensure that banks are not penalized for holding risk-free assets like deposits at central banks?
Senator, I see the time has expired. May I answer the question?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you. What I'd like to do, if confirmed as Vice Chair, is to come in and take a look at capital and liquidity in the system, broadly speaking, to look at the SLR, to look at the Basel III so-called endgame rules that need to be proposed, and to try and take a look at this as a whole rather than piece by piece.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Brown has asked me to preside for a while, so we'll do that. I'm going to recognize myself. Mr. Barr, there's a serious diversity problem at the Federal Reserve. Latinos are the nation's largest minority. They make up 20% of the United States